Okay, sorry. Thank you. Thank you. And that was a fantastic presentation by the Honourable Justice. Such interesting concepts, and so wonderful to hear that kind of insight coming for the judiciary. I too would like to extend my thanks to the organisers for this conference. It is rare to see, I think, in the academic world, those kind of linkages between climate justice and transition. So I was very happy to come along and join this discussion and this conversation. So I'm going to talk about this topic in particular in relation to the textile sector, where I've been doing a lot of the work on these sorts of issues. So I am the director of the QUT Centre for Justice. So this is an interdisciplinary research centre that is really focused, I guess, on research for change. And so we're looking and particularly focused on making the delivery of justice available and meaningful to all, regardless of social, legal, political and economic circumstances. We have 4 main research themes, which are in the middle of this diagram here. And I guess the themes that I'm talking about tonight particularly touch on the global justice and the social and environmental justice as well. So tonight I am honing in on a particular sector, and it may be a sector that people may not be overly familiar with. I wasn't until I began working in this sector as well. But when we begin to look at the textile sector, we need to break it down into the various different parts or tiers of the sector to examine what are the environmental and justice impacts at each of these different phases of the sector. So in textile language, these are called tiers, but I'll refer for ease up here to what they are. So when we begin to look at fibre production, quite often we're looking at biodiversity loss, use of pesticides, high use of water and greenhouse gas emissions in the production of many of the raw materials leading to textiles. This then moves on to yarn and fabric production again, which has greenhouse gas emissions and other issues as well. Textile production involves quite a lot of chemicals and also textile waste and labour abuses as well in terms of the production. We then have the consumption of textiles, where we're looking at the distribution and retail and the use phase of textiles. And then we have the end of life phase. And as we're probably all aware, this is a significant issue that is only increased attention due to the shipment of the global north's unwanted used textiles to the global south. So what I'm presenting on today is a lot of the research that I've been doing with the United Nations Environment Project, the One Textile Initiative. And when they outline the impacts of the textile sector, they see it as contributing to the triple planetary crisis. So not only contributing to climate change, but also producing biodiversity and pollution issues. So 2 to 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions are actually attributed to the textile sector. Obviously, this has implications in terms of the Paris Agreement goals. The sector is very, very, very water dependent. So it uses 215 trillion litres of water per year. Again, this has implications under the Global Biodiversity Framework, which says that businesses must assess and disclose biodiversity dependencies, impacts and risks. And 9% of annual microfibre pollution into oceans comes from textile production again. And this relates to the global framework on chemicals, which has been created, which says that by 2030, companies must implement measures to prevent and minimise effects of chemicals. And that deadline is coming rapidly. Within the Paris Agreement, there is a voluntary agreement for the textile sector, and this is known as the UNFCCC Fashion Charter for Climate Action. So this is a voluntary agreement that fashion companies can sign up to. And they can sign up to either set science-based targets on emission reductions for scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions within 24 months of signing up, or they can sign up to commit to reduce by 50% their greenhouse gas emissions against a no earlier baseline than 2019. So this is somewhat positive. The Charter creates 13 different commitments of sorts of different activities. So it provides a framework, at least providing guidance for fashion companies as to what they need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So by 2023, we only had 100 signatories. Now, that is a small number when you look at the number of small and medium enterprises and large multinational enterprises producing fashion across the globe. That, of course, is reliant largely on the fact that at this stage, this is a voluntary agreement, which, as we know, is where most of these sorts of arrangements starts. So what are the employment or the kind of just transition or climate justice impacts of decarbonisation? So moving away from the current levels of consumption and production of textiles will have impacts beyond just positive impacts for the environment. This will have a likely significant impact on how, where, and how textiles are produced. We also need to note that the textile workforce is predominantly female or women-led, and it's a gendered. And so these kinds of jobs will have a gendered implication as well. And so how do we ensure a just transition in this sector? So we can look to the COVID-19 experience and what happened to the sector in COVID-19 to gain insights to the sorts of climate justice and just transition issues that could arise in the future. So the pandemic highlighted the precarity and injustice, which is part of the ordinary and everyday structures of the textile value chain. We all know that there are labour and environmental risks of the textile value chain, but these just continue to operate as an everyday standard practice at the moment. So if we look at what were the impacts on individual and public health during the pandemic, we know that there was an inadequate supply of PPE in textile factories. So that was placing workers at a significant increased risk of infection. There was a huge impact on job security. There was a lot of loss of jobs with the slowdown in global demand. There was unfair termination of union members, pregnant and older workers. Wages were unpaid, and some workers just received partial payment for their work as well. And there was a more significant impact on women and families. As I explained, 80% of the workforce is female, and there was a significant increase in the care role at home for women. So not only were they losing their income, but they were increasing in care responsibilities. A vulnerable group in this sector as well is migrant workers. These workers often have worse conditions than local workers. And the lockdown also presented issues in returning home, returning to and from places of work as well. And the full briefing paper on that is available here on the QUT Centre Justice briefing paper, linked on the slide. So the International Labour Organization has produced the Just Transition in Textile Sector in Asia Toolkit. And this is really just recognising that as we move towards an ecologically sound economy, we must also plan for positive outcomes for communities and people negatively affected by global and national efforts to decarbonise. So this is just recognising that there are winners and losers in decarbonisation. And it means that people in jobs and occupations that decline or are phased out, we need pathways mapped to other viable and decent employment being the key criteria here. And we need to create structures to allow for that transition. And so some of the points that are on this slide are just some of the basic mechanisms that can be used to plan for that transition. So the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance has begun to look at some of the mechanisms that are needed to finance this sort of just transition. So this is the idea that we need to integrate just transitions into national climate plans and development strategies. And so these, I think, as the Justice was just saying, need to not just be thinking about mitigation, but also adaptation in these climate strategies for each of these sectors as well. And there needs to be targeted identification of what are the challenges for each particular sector. So I'm talking about the textile sector, but this is relevant for all sectors, agriculture, energy and other sectors as well. We need to look at options to mobilise and access financial resources for just transitions. So what do financial instruments for just transitions look like? What has worked? Are there any examples of things being rolled out for small and medium enterprises that actually assist them in making this sustainable transition? Because as we know, a lot of the players in this field are small and medium enterprises who don't have large capacity to rapidly change their practices. We need to also make enabling environments and policy frameworks for financing. So this means that we actually need integrating just transition into government fiscal policies and public expenditure, but also into overseas development aid and budgets and contributions as well. And we need to ensure that in these frameworks, we're focusing on vulnerable people in these situations. And we are also thinking about how to fund the transition of economic assets. So the sorts of equipment and machinery that is required for these sectors as well, and the technology transfer. So for the remainder of the presentation, I was just going to quickly touch on a few of the different projects that I've done in the textile space and the lessons that we've sort of begun to learn. So in 2019, and this was following the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, the Cotton Research and Development Corporation was very interested in whether they were going to be bound by the Modern Slavery Act. So this particular organisation represents all of the cotton growers in Australia. And so what they wanted to know as producers of a raw material, if we export that material abroad, will we be counted or covered by modern slavery legislation? The answer is no, because modern slavery legislation doesn't tend to work downstream. Rather, it works upstream. And so we identified 7 solutions about what we could do within Australia to improve the risk of labour abuses, because it is known that we are growing a commodity that is then sold into a global value chain where there are high risk labour abuses. So what can we do to prevent that? So the first thing is, I guess, very progressive and more of a dream type target would be the introduction of due diligence laws, which we've seen in the EU, but ones that include downstream due diligence, not just upstream due diligence. There's options to use things like cotton certification to talk about that this product was not produced using labour or high emission criteria. There's supply chain transparency measures, which is all about information disclosure around emissions, environmental and labour risk factors, traceability, and this is using things like blockchain and other technologies to attach to the product as it moves through supply chains. In Australia, we were talking about the idea of reshoring or right shoring. So is there a sense that actually some of this production should be moving onshore where rights can be ensured and protected? The answer to that was largely no. Strategic partnerships and collaboration between supply chain actors and collaboration with worker-driven initiatives. The next phase of work has largely been completed for the United Nations Environment Project, and in particular, the One UNEP Textiles initiative. This has involved 3 phases of work. The first, a report on environmental permitting, a very large report. Secondly, toolkits providing regulation advice for governments on particular regulatory reforms that can be introduced to address these issues. And the current project, which is on creating circularity policy case studies. So the first project, and this report will be publicly available soon, is the role of environmental permitting systems in supporting the transition to sustainable textile value chain. And so this was really an analysis of environmental permit or licensing arrangements in countries. And effectively what we were evaluating is, are in factories that are producing textiles going through an environmental impact assessment? And secondly, are they holding an environmental permit or license, which to it attaches conditions around chemical use, water, air emissions? So we were going out to see what is the practice in these 10 countries. Is there a standard approach to how textiles are dealt with? The answer is no. So we looked at the countries listed on the slide here, Bangladesh, Brazil, China, Egypt, Germany, India, Indonesia, Jordan, Turkey, and the United States. There was no common approach to how textiles are dealt with. And furthermore, what we found is that in many instances, there were large loopholes where textile factories did not need to undergo any kind of environmental impact assessment to open. And could hold an environmental permit without any consideration of the impact on the environment. The next phase of the project has focused on toolkits again, which will be publicly available soon. And these are toolkits for high production textile countries. So these are the countries that are producing textiles, high consumption countries. So this is really the global north countries as well, and high used textiles importing countries. So the countries that are getting all of the used textiles shipped in. In these particular toolkits, we follow a 4-phase approach. And probably the most interesting part of these instruments here is where we actually come through and list all of the different reforms that are happening for production, consumption, and used textiles, all of the different regulatory initiatives. We did a global mapping exercise and we came up with 260 different sorts of legal reforms across the globe targeting the textile sector. And then we've broken them down and categorized them according to whether they're for high production or high consumption, and then the type of instrument and tool it is. Is it something driven by market? Is it voluntary? Is it mandatory? Those sorts of things. So again, beginning to look at what are the laws and policies that are beginning to drive these issues as well. And then the final set of work, sorry, I'm nearly finished. The final set of work is really looking to develop 15 case studies, taking a deep dive into policies that are being implemented. So there is a recognition that we don't have any kind of international agreement on textiles, and that given that we've got an interconnected global value chain, that this could be something that we need. So we're looking to create some case studies to show where national action is limited and why there may be a need for a global textile policy dialogue. We are in the phase 1 and we are currently preparing case studies on Pakistan, Australia, Ghana, and the Netherlands. Pakistan is doing some really interesting things around the regulation of chemicals and is really being quite progressive in that front as well. And that is what will be featured in that case study. I will pop a link for the survey recruitment into the chat just in case it's relevant. We are looking for government representatives. Sorry, and so just as an overall summary, the textile sector is a significant contributor to the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. The sector is also known for labour abuses and is a gendered workforce. A just transition requires detailed policy for each sector, and there is a very big need to consider how such a transition will be financed, especially for the textile sector, which has a lot of small and medium enterprises. And research work to date has identified a range of supply chain regulatory reforms, but we don't know what the impact and implementation of these reforms are because they are so new.